Hi there, Rob Zachney for IGN here. I just reviewed this War of Mine, the new wartime survival game from 11-Bit Studios. Games can be ridiculously reductive portrayals of complex problems. Everything is eventually solvable via learning and repetition. And what games can sometimes unwittingly teach you is that bad things don't happen to good people, or smart people, or hardworking people. They happen to people who did the wrong thing at the wrong time, but everything would have been just fine if you just played the system a little bit better. What I love about this War of Mine is that it never lets you forget that the world doesn't actually work that way. War doesn't work that way. As you try and lead a group of survivors during an unnamed conflict by scavenging for items, jury-rigging survival aids like heaters and vegetable gardens, and bartering with other survivors for goods, you might occasionally feel like you're getting the hang of wartime survival. But then the game reminds you, in shockingly effective and heartbreaking fashion, that in war, all you're planning is nothing next to the chaos and cruelty that surrounds you. But this War of Mine wouldn't be half as good as it is if it weren't also an effective survival game. It's divided into two phases. By day you do chores around your shelter, building new items, harvesting and filtering rainwater, and cooking food for your characters. By night you go scavenging around the city in a tense, atmospheric 2D stealth game. While some locations are abandoned looters' playgrounds, the war-torn city features a lot of other unsavory types. Soldiers and militia might be willing to trade with you or ignore you, but they can turn on you in a heartbeat. Other survivors might shoot you on sight. Rummaging through a pile of rubble sends sound waves far into the distance, alerting people to your presence. But things get especially tricky because your survivors don't just care about surviving. They're civilians, they're ordinary people. They care about how they survive. They have ethical lines that they won't cross, or if you do cross them, then there's going to be an emotional cost. I'll give you an example. In one game, I had this character, Roman, who was an ex-soldier who had deserted when the horrors of war became too much for him. He was the only one of my survivors who was a trained fighter, so when one of my scavengers was shot and nearly killed by some paranoid survivors guarding their home, I sent Roman back the next night with an assault rifle and a knife. I admit, I overreacted, but I figured, hey, these people nearly killed one of mine, so we're going to kill one of theirs, and then we're going to take their medical supplies for our trouble. So that's what Roman did. He stabbed one of them who was standing guard, and then he shot and killed their sniper. Then he stepped over the last survivor who was just weeping over the corpses of her friends, and he grabbed all their medicine and food and took it back to our party. Took it back to our shelter. It all worked well, except that Roman was emotionally destroyed by that night. He came back to the shelter in the next morning and just collapsed. He couldn't be moved. He wouldn't work, couldn't go out scavenging. He just sat there, and his morale state had changed to broken. And the rest of the party started to get depressed as well. And suddenly, just like that, we were in a death spiral. We had the supplies we needed to survive, but nobody really wanted to. They were all horrified by what Roman had done, and by extension, I guess, what they had done, and the toll it took on all of them. Without the booze, coffee, and cigarettes that made the boring, depressing life of a survivor bearable, they couldn't recover. There was no way to sort of restore the equilibrium, so one by one, they all fell into depression and despair. Roman left. Another person just stayed in bed and wouldn't get up. And slowly, we went right back to starving. Tailspins like that mean that you'll end up replaying this War of Mine a lot. So it's good that there's so much variation between playthroughs. The same locations are recycled, but what you find there is random. One time your game might start in the dead of winter when you have to burn fuel for warmth, while another game starts in early autumn and the temperatures will stay warm for weeks before winter finally arrives. In one location, a church might be a sanctuary run by a kindly priest where you can do some bartering, but in the next playthrough it might be overrun by bandits who may or may not try to kill you. But this War of Mine never lets you forget that it's about a serious and sad subject. As things begin to go wrong, the choices get harder. That's what got Roman and my team of survivors in that playthrough I just described. But there's a lot of other dilemmas you find as well. Do you intervene when you see a soldier assaulting a woman in a ruined supermarket, even though he might kill you? Or do you keep your head down and just take what you need? If you can't pay the doctors at the hospital, do you shoot the guard and take the medicine anyway? These questions don't have right answers. But posing them and putting the moral issues in sharp relief alongside the physical ones is what makes this war of mine one of the year's most thought-provoking games. That's why I give it a high recommendation and a score of 8.4. So for more on survival games, stick with IGN.